This is Stone Cold Export, and today we are pushing the best 6-core gaming CPUs to their limits to see which one performs the best. Alright, let's just get started with the test systems. For the AMD R5 3600 we are using PBO and Auto OC with a 200 MHz offset. This will allow the R5 3600 to boost to 4.4 GHz in lightly threaded loads. And for memory we have 2 times 8 GB of the DDR4 memory running at 3733 MHz with 1530 timings, essentially Ryzen calculator fast timings. The Infinity Fabric is then manually set to 1866 MHz. And the next CPU is the Intel i5 10600K. This is overclocked to 4.9 GHz on all cores. 5 GHz was possible but required an absurd amount of voltage, so we stopped at 4.9. We are also running the cache at 4.6 GHz and the memory at 4266 MHz with 1632 timings. With better memory sticks we could run the memory even faster, but I did have these sticks running at 4600 MHz, but it was not stable at all, so 4266 it is. The last CPU is the AMD Ryzen R5 5600X. Like the 3600, we are running PBO and Auto OC with a 200 MHz offset. This will allow the CPU to boost to 4.8 or 4.85 GHz in lightly threaded loads. The memory was run at the same 3733 MHz speed as the R5 3600, and this was due to the Infinity Fabric refusing to run any faster than 1866, which was a bit disappointing, but it's not critical. All CPUs were cooled by a 280mm AIO, the Corsair H115i. The Intel CPU was running on the Gigabyte C490 Elite AC, while the AMD CPUs were tested with the ASRock B550M Pro 4. And the GPU we are using is the AMD RX 6800. With all that out of the way, let's just dive into the numbers. We start off with the ever popular Cinebench R20. Here the R5 3600 is coming in last and saw the smallest gain with the overclock out of all the CPUs, both for single and multi-core score. The i5 10600K is coming in ahead of the 3600 in both the single and multi-threaded tests here. I should mention that I bought my 3600 at launch, and later versions probably have better silicon and can manage a 4.4 GHz all-core overclock, which will perform much better than this. But topping the list here is the 5600X, which saw a massive gain. And this is probably due to the change in cooler, so the stock numbers here are with the stock rate stealth heatsink. And single core score sees a small but still significant increase and leaves the i5 in the dust. Our next workload is transcoding a 4K video to 1080p with Handbrake. Here the R5 3600 overclocked comes in last, almost matching the 5600X with the stock cooler. The 10600K sees a 15% boost from the overclock, while the 5600X sees a slightly larger boost of 16%, in part due to the improved cooling. And the result is that the 5600 wins this test. 5600X wins this test. Next up is DaVinci Resolve, and here I use some heavy fusion effects that are somewhat single-threaded, particle effects and such. Therefore the 5600X sees a 3% or 11-second reduction in render time. The 3600 sees a 18% reduction in render time with the overclock, while the i5 10600K sees the largest performance bump at 31%. In 3D Mod Timespy, the i5 10600K is able to retain its lead, although it's very slightly over the 5600X, and how relevant this is in regards to actual gaming performance is yet to be seen. Speaking of which, let's take a look at the gaming benchmarks. I tested mostly at 1080p with some 1440p testing in a few games, but mostly 1080p. We start off with Assetto Corsa Competitzione. The 10600K sees the largest performance increase of 17%, followed by the 3600 at 13%. The 5600X had the least to gain from the overclock, but a 9% increase is something at least, and there was only 1080p testing in this title. 1440p would be pretty similar, as we are limited by the CPU and not the GPU in this test. Let's move on to Battlefield 5. Here we test on an empty community server at the Devastation map. We also increase max FPS to 300 from 200. and we see pretty decent gains from the overclocks on all CPUs. The smallest gain was seen on our Intel test system. It still manages to hold on to second place, and it is faster than a stock 5600X, but ultimately the overclocked 5600X is 9% faster here. In addition, the 5600X is a full 20% faster than the overclocked 3600, which itself delivers very respectable performance, moving things up to 1440p, and again the Intel system barely sees any benefit in the average frame rate, although frame times are very much improved with the overclock. The overclocked 3600 is now able to almost match the stock 5600X and 10600K, while the 5600X is now in a 4% lead over the overclocked 10600K. Next up is a very popular battle royale game these days. It's Call of Duty Warzone. Here we benchmark inside a match around the quarry section of the map. As always, these are 3-round averages, but margin of error is a bit larger here. Neither of the AMD CPUs sees a substantial increase with the overclock, with 6% for the 3600 and a mere 2% for the 5600X. We might be closing in on the GPU bottleneck with the 5600X. The i5 10600K actually sees a 14%. The 10600K sees a 14% increase in performance with the overclock, and its frame times are actually ahead of the 5600X. So if you're after a smooth gaming experience in Warzone, the 5600X or an overclocked 10600K seems to be the best choice. Next game is Cyberpunk 2077. We test in a very crowded area around Corporate Plaza, which seems to be hammering the CPU pretty good. The 5600X takes the lead yet again. It's a rather small lead, only 3% ahead of the Intel system. The 3600 is lagging a bit further behind at 1080p, even when overclocked. If you increase the resolution to 1440p, then the overclocked 3600 is on par with the 10600K, and the overclock is on par with the 10600K, with the overclocked 5600X edging them both out. No major differences though. In Dota 2, we had some interesting results. The 5600X destroys the other CPUs in this game. Even the overclocked 10600K is not able to match the stock 5600X, while the 3600 is not even breaking the 200 frames per second barrier. Still, the 191 frames per second of the 3600 should be plenty for most people, but for those of you with a 240Hz monitor, the 5600X seems like a better choice. The Elder Scrolls Online is the next title, and this game runs really well on AMD CPUs, possibly due to the larger cache, I don't know. But the 3600 beats the 10600K here. Overclocked, the 3600 is matching the stock 5600X, which when overclocked gets a 19% performance boost and takes the lead at 107.7 frames per second on average. This game, even with a mid-range GPU such as a 1660, is pretty much completely CPU bound even at 4K, so we should see similar numbers at 1440p and 4K, but I only tested at 1080p. Next title is Rainbow Six Siege. This is yet another game where the 5600X destroys the other CPUs. The overclocked 3600 is able to surpass the stock 10600K, but falls short of the 5600X. Same story with the 10600K, although once overclocked the performance is pretty similar to the stock 5600X, but once overclocked the 5600X gains a 20% performance boost and leaves the other CPUs way behind. Although in practice the performance between these CPUs are probably indistinguishable. At 1440p things close up considerably, and now the overclocked 5600X and 10600K is hitting the GPU bottleneck at a mere 426 frames per second on average. Moving on then to The Sims 4, this is another game where the 5600X gets to flex its muscles. Again, the stock 5600X is only matched by the overclocked 10600K, with the 3600 falling quite a ways behind both the 5600X and the stock 10600K here. Moving on to Shadow the Tomb Raider, at 1080p the overclocked 3600 is keeping up with the stock 10600K, with the 5600X being 13% ahead. Overclocked, the 10600K is 23% faster. Moving on to Shadow the Tomb Raider, at 1080p the overclocked 3600 is keeping up with the stock 10600K, with the 5600X being 13% ahead. Overclock, the 10600K is 23% faster than that stock, which has it surpassing the stock 5600X. The overclocked 5600X has a 6% lead over the overclocked 10600K at 1080p. And if we move to 1440p, all the overclocked CPUs here pretty much perform identical, for the most part. So let's take a look at the 10 game average. Here the stock 3600 brings up the rear with an average frame rate of 143.6 across all these games. The stock 10600K and the overclocked 3600X delivers pretty much the same performance and is 11% ahead of its stock 3600. The stock 5600X is 27% faster than the stock 3600, which is a pretty impressive gen-over-gen increase. The overclocked 10600K just edges out the stock 5600X, but it's the overclocked 5600X that steals the show, being on average 15% faster than the overclocked 10600K. Lastly, let's take a look at what is, in my opinion, the most important aspect: value. I'm using the overclocked numbers for this, but you can go ahead and use the price in your area and the 10 game average from our last slide. I used the MSRP for the 5600X and the prices I could find on PC Part Picker for the two other CPUs. And this is a bit of a shocker. I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but the Intel i5 10600K is the best value of these CPUs. It's pretty close between the 3600 and 10600K, but the 10600K edges out the 3600 here. And this should be pretty representative of what you can expect, as both my 3600 and my 10600K are pretty poor overclockers. The 5600X is a bit too expensive in my opinion. In fact, where I live, you can get a i9 10850K, a 10-core Intel CPU, for about $80 more than the 5600X, and personally, I would rather go with that over the 5600X, even if the 5600X is a bit faster in gaming, because the 10850K with its 10 cores should be better at multitasking, and probably rendering will also use a good bit more power, of course. But there is no disputing that the 5600X is the fastest 6-core gaming CPU right now, and also the most expensive. And that's it from me for now. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe and farewell.